Well, welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly. I have not done one of these podcasts in a really long time, but I understand, Jeff, you haven't been doing conversations with Jeff either, so I'm not the only one.
Yeah,
That,
I definitely need to bring that one back. It's
yeah,
been I think since like the
right,
fall that I've done that one.
right. Well, the thing about it is I just got kidnapped by reality, and there were a lot of things going on where I had to withdraw from everything for quite a while. But I wanted to talk about Enemies Within the Church, which is a documentary which came out. It came out officially in November. I think it really started to hit a lot of the places on the circuit a little bit later, like maybe late December. But it hasn't gotten as much attention as I was hoping that it would get. So I wanted to talk to Jeff about it. I know that Jeff kind of has inroads in a lot of different communities of conservatives who I think would really care about the documentary, but they haven't heard about it. So how much do you know about Enemies Within the Church, Jeff?
Quite a bit. I actually watched probably half of it today. But
Hmm.
I've known Judd Saul and Trevor Loudon and Kerry Gordon for quite a while now, and been kind of following their journey as they're putting this
Hmm.
documentary together. So I've known a lot of behind the scenes stuff, but today was actually the first time I was actually watching it. I got through about half of it. And it was really really good.
Yeah, what did you think? If you could summarize your takeaway from it?
Yeah, I think that they do a very good job of making the case about, obviously, just as we all know, there's been this kind of leftist takeover that's happened in our country, but
Hmm.
it really stems from the leftist takeover within the church, and that specifically goes for these Marxist, socialist, communists that have come in and brought these false doctrines, false teachings, this woke theology into the church. And I think a lot of these Protestant pastors, especially, have bought it hook, line, and sinker, and are leading their congregations astray. And they do a really good job of not only exposing a lot of the pastors and the churches that are implementing this, but also the ideology and the worldview and what it actually stems from, which I think is really important for people to understand.
Yes, that is what they were looking at, is basically what happened. It begins with the question, what happened to the American church? I think that they had a really tough a tough goal that they set for themselves, because you're trying to go to an inherently conservative community, basically Christian evangelicals, and you're telling them that the church has a problem, which a lot of people don't want to even admit, and you're telling them that the church actually has been integral in the degradation of the culture and in the decline of conservative values, and people don't want to hear it. I think that the conservative movement, if we could go back, and I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember if we can go back to like the 90s, uh, there were a few things that people took for granted in the conservative movement. They took for granted that the church was on our side, the military was on our side, and big business was on our side, because that was the essence, right, of the three-legged stool that Reagan had put forward as conservatism. And I think it took them a while, but they figured out that businesses are actually not on our side. Businesses are very much, they're consumerist. They're on the left. They figured out the military is not really on our side. The military is basically a centralized authoritarian institution. And if the government tells them that they need to re-engineer social relationships and identities, the military will do it, as long as they get their wars and they get their careers. But I think the last thing that conservatives have finally realized, that the church really isn't on our side. It's really hard because so many conservatives, they listen to conservative media all week long, and then they go to church on Sunday. And it took them a while to put the dots together and realize that the institution where they know people, where they have a pastor, where they're studying the Bible, is actually at odds with their value system. And it leaves people with this really disturbing sense that there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere left to go. If we lose the church, we've lost everything. And I think it is fitting that I've kind of come out of hiding to talk about this now, because we just saw what happened in the Ukraine. And I think that there are actually a lot of parallels that I want to get into a little bit later to understand what happened in the Ukraine and what went on in American churches leading up to that. But I guess the biggest thing with enemies within the church is, Jeff, because you may not be aware of some of the publication history of it. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about it and then see, what you think the next steps are for people who want this film to get out there. Judd Sauls he came out with this documentary. I think it's a very hard-hitting documentary. It really is well documented. It supported all of its assertions, and it was very quickly blacklisted. So the president of Southwestern Seminary, Adam Greenway, who I have a very tortured history with, he actually tried to get the film censored. Literally, he wrote an open letter, and he had the chairman of the board of Southwestern, who is a pastor in North Richland Hills. They wrote a letter to another seminary saying, "Don't show this film, that you should prohibit showing this film," because he cited an unofficial policy from the early 90s that said that they would never host any events that were critical of other Southern Baptists. So when Adam Greenway did that, he kind of proved the point of the film, which is that they're changing the doctrine. They're really exploiting the church for their own political purposes, and they're willing to engage in censorship and intimidation and persecution in order to do it. So that happened. But what's scary is that even after Greenway did that, the documentary just still has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I've been watching the Liberty Daily. It didn't really get picked up at the Liberty Daily, even with Kerry Gordon, who is often posted on the Liberty Daily. And Kerry Gordon is a pastor in Iowa. He's a big part of the film. I think he's probably the main character in the documentary, but it just hasn't gotten out there. I think a lot of the people who are loyal to John MacArthur, and that the film does not take on John MacArthur. It could have. I mean, there's a lot you could say about John MacArthur, but a lot of people in that John MacArthur circle, they don't want to talk about the film. I was really surprised that Owen Strachan, however you pronounce his name, Owen Strachan, he didn't talk about the film. A lot of the people like the Doug Wilson types and they just didn't want to talk about this movie. And maybe it's because it's hitting too close to home because it criticizes El Moeller. Everyone now criticizes Russell Moore, but I think people are still really afraid of endorsing anything that criticizes the people who put Russell Moore in power, which would be El Moeller and company. I don't know. What do you think would be a solution to get an audience beyond the kind of restricted audience that the film has gotten up until now?
Yeah, I honestly, I think that unfortunately, I think it's really easy to try to rely on the current systems that are in place. But the problem is that these systems that are in place for distribution and getting the word out and things like that, that's the very system that they're kind of confronting with this documentary when you think about it, and I see, I know you mentioned that there's like parallels between this and what's going on with like Ukraine and Russia, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. But there's also a lot of comparisons about what's happening between the swamp in DC and the swamp of evangelicalism. And you can even argue there's a lot of parallels between what's going on here and what's going on with this civil war that we're going on with when it comes to the Republican Party.
Right.
Because what we're seeing is that these supposedly good guys in all these different scenarios, the supposedly leaders of the evangelical movement or the conservative movement or whatever it is, they talk a great game. They come out, they'll say the right things when they're interviewed on CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News or something along those lines. But when push comes to shove, they will not work with the people that are actually doing something right because they don't want them to disrupt it. So even if we're talking about somebody who's arguably good, because I mean, you mentioned somebody like a John MacArthur or a Doug Wilson or a lot of these guys are controversial. Some guys like them, some don't, things along those lines. But there's a certain degree of they don't want to rock the boat too much because they still rely on these false teachers and these guys embracing social justice and Marxism and all of that. They're relying on them for their paycheck, whether it's for conferences, for books, for guest speaking gigs, for interviews, whatever it might be. So realistically, I don't even think that Judd and Kerry and Trevor Loudon and all those guys realized it when they set out to make this documentary. But they're kind of taking on this entire system, this entire ecosystem within evangelicalism. And I think it's going to be a lot bigger fight than I think any of us actually realized when all this stuff started.
Well, yeah. And I think the problem is that there are certain people that are easy punching bags, low hanging fruit Russell Moore. Everyone complains about him. There was that Renton Evangelical article about him. He was the former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. It's kind of easy to criticize him, but just one or two removes from him, there are always people that they become sacred cows. And it's been hard for people in the church world to understand that it's not what people say, it's what they do. And very often it's what they do in secret. It's not their public statements or their public positions, because everyone in the evangelical world is going to say that they believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? But what do they do behind the scenes when there are people in their orbit who are actually doing things to kind of try to advance the biblical view of sexuality and fight against the distortion of that view of sexuality in the schools, whether they're public schools or Christian schools? Those people get fired. I'm the living example of it, right? If you stand up to them, they get fired. And the people who are at the top, who might have a public position that's very biblical, they have family members that are tied into these communities. They have money coming in behind the scenes. Sometimes it's a condition of the grants that they're getting from the government. A lot of times it's a condition of their ability to continue to get access to platforms, like to be interviewed in newspapers or on TV. And so they will, behind the scenes, completely undermine what their public position is, because their game ultimately is they want this real estate. They want the church, the equity of the churches. They want the access, the cultural influence, the power that comes with this captive audience every Sunday of churchgoers. And they're going to try to get that influence to the maximum amount, no matter what it takes. If that means that they have to talk out of both sides of their mouths and tell the people in the pews that they're fighting against the LGBT lobby, while on the other side of things, they're taking the orders from the LGBT lobby to get rid of the troublemakers who are standing in the way of full inclusion of LGBTs in the church. They're going to talk out of both sides of their mouth. It's hard for Christians to understand that. The movie really clearly points out how this works. It points out the fact that you have people like Albert Mohler, and you have people that are tied to him who will make this public position and will try to present themselves as very conservative, and they're working against everything behind the scenes. I think that I almost wish that they could find some surprise validator, some person that you wouldn't normally expect, who all of a sudden would see this and say, oh my gosh, this is the big issue we have to look at right now. I think that they kind of found that in Megan Bashan, who was a writer at the Daily Wire, but they haven't really found that yet. And so they're not getting onto the Liberty Daily or those other kinds of sites. So there's a lot of people who need to see this, who are not seeing the documentary. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, well, and I think to a certain degree, I think for right now, it seems like they're going through the right process and the right end game right now, where what they're actually doing is they're just going directly to the people. So I know I've been seeing Carrie posting on Facebook that they're going around church to church almost and showing this documentary in churches, and if you are taking on the system, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the instant quick hit where you instantly get seen by millions of people. So by bypassing the current evangelical ecosystem that's in play, that would you would normally turn to for promotion, I think that the next best option is to do the long game. It's slower. It takes more energy and more work, but I think it's more effective because now you're going directly to the people. And especially by having events where Carrie or Judd or Trevor or some of these guys are actually at these events where they're showing it to 100, 300, 500 people at a time. Now, all of a sudden, now they're making this personal connection. Now they can actually ask them questions. Now they can actually say, well, what do I do with this information? And they can actually have a little bit of give and take that I think to a certain degree they wouldn't have if they were able to play through the normal channels. So to a certain degree, it may be a blessing in disguise by being forced to kind of go this route in order to get it out to the masses.
Yeah, it's a good point. All right. Well, I promised you that I was going to relate this to the Ukraine crisis. And I think there's an important connection here to what's going on as we're watching everything unfold in the Ukraine. First of all the big Eva types who were just beating the war drums over masks, that were, constantly talking about Christian nationalism and attacking Trump supporters. They're all now in lockstep, completely saying we have to stand with the people of Ukraine and implicitly supporting any kind of interventionist policy by Biden. Okay, I think that as Christians, we have to be able to take a step back when we see some gigantic crisis like this unfolding, and we have to go back to what the biblical principles are underlying it. Obviously, we can all look at the aggression committed by Russia, and we can see that something's wrong there. But we have to ask, why do we know that it's wrong? Why do we know that it's wrong for Russia to do what we did? And I think the idea there is that it's authoritarianism, and it's a hunger for power, and it is a ruthlessness, right? And I think that it's obviously a concern, a preoccupation with power, with resources, with money, basically the oldest sins in the book, right? That have led us to this point. I think that what people in the evangelical world need to ask themselves is, to what extent are those very same negative qualities present in the people who are leading evangelicals? Because I can tell you, if you look at that documentary and you follow what happened at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, that was a case where you had a seminary that was run by Paige Patterson, and they took that man out. They just came up with every single accusation in the book, whether it was half true, whether it was 75% true or 20% true. They threw everything at him. They marshaled all of the propaganda in the press to demonize him. They claimed that they were going to replace him simply because he was not good on women and on sexual abuse. Then they replaced him with someone who was even worse, because I got in trouble because I was writing about same-sex abuse, and I wrote about my experience as a survivor of same-sex abuse, and I got fired for doing that. I got fired for doing it because I talked about it and I submitted resolutions to the Southern Baptist Convention, and it was ruthless the way that Adam Greenway and the people who came in, they had no regard whatsoever to the impact on people's personal lives. They fired, most of the faculty. By this point, most of the faculty are gone that had been hired by the previous guy. They basically published falsehoods about people, and they really demonized everyone that they were trying to get rid of. So when they got rid of me, they told everyone on the campus that I was bad, that they made up stuff that wasn't even true. And, there was one secretary that I used to see every day. And then I heard back from someone else that at church, she was going around telling everyone that I was a liar and that I was weird, and that, they are authoritarian. These are ruthless people who are running the church. And, I had a lot of experience at that seminary, but it is not limited to that seminary. I think the same behavior you're going to find from a lot of the megachurch pastors. It's the way missions are run, the International Missions Board, and the domestic missions. It's the way the seminaries are run. Clearly, it's the way a lot of the state conventions are run, and it's the way a lot of the churches are run. So one of the things that I hope people can take away from the film, which I hope doesn't get lost, is that, yes, it's about one political camp kind of moving in and enforcing its ideology contrary to Christianity upon the churches, but it's also about just those sins of being an authoritarian leader and of putting your worldly ambitions before the kingdom, really trying to take things that belong to God and to put them to your own use. And whenever you get to that point, it follows naturally that you start to become ruthless. Would you agree with me that a lot of what you see in the evangelical world is ruthless?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, like you said, you've experienced it to a certain degree. I've experienced it coming from
Yeah,
the MacArthur camp of,
yeah.
I've been stalked, like legitimately stalked. I've been my entire character has been completely maligned and slandered by that
Mhm.
camp, simply because I oppose some of the things that John MacArthur has said. So I've been on the receiving end of that. But I
Right,
think that,
yeah.
so from that perspective, I know what happens. And in reality, with me being both in the Christian world and in the political world, I would much rather deal with the political world. They're not nearly as ruthless as these evangelical leaders are, which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
Right.
When I'm thinking about a really good comparison, I'm taking it back to the Pharisees, because we see a lot of the same tactics being used by these evangelical leaders when it comes to the Pharisees. Look at what the Pharisees did to Jesus and his disciples. They lied about him. They slandered him. They did whatever they could to try to silence him. They eventually put him to death. Think about this. The religious leaders of Israel at that time were so opposed to the Son of God that they legitimately had him put to death. That's how committed they are to holding on to power and protecting their reputation and protecting their money and protecting their entire establishment. That's what we're going up against with a lot of these evangelical leaders, where they are willing to do whatever it takes to hold on to their power, hold on to their influence, hold on to their fame and their income and all of that. So you've got to understand that if you go back and you read like Matthew 23, you see Jesus' description of the Pharisees, and he calls them liars and hypocrites and exposes them for all to see.
Right.
The parallel between the Pharisees of that time and then the evangelical leaders of today is uncanny.
Yeah, it is. I think you hit it, and I know that you went through the same thing with MacArthur that I went through on the Southern Baptist end. And I think that as we're watching things unfold in the Ukraine, I just wish that people would step out of their instinct, which is to pick a side and to immediately go along with the demonization of one side. I'm not justifying, Putin at all, but I wish that people would step back and ask, how does authoritarianism play out in the world that is available to me, in the world that is my social orbit? And I think that all of the sins that we see with the aggression against Ukraine, I have no doubt that a lot of these evangelical leaders, particularly in the Southern Baptist Convention, that if they had an army, they would kill their enemies. I have no doubt that they would, because I watched Adam Greenway and his minions come in, and they intentionally sent in people to disrupt people's friendships. When you were on the out, when you're on the blacklist, in that evangelical world, like I was, I mean, people that you've been friends with for years, they won't talk to you. I lost my agent. Radio hosts that I had been close friends with, all of a sudden started demonizing me on Twitter. And all of the people that were friends with them demonized you. All of the people that I worked with, none of them will talk to you. They'll shun you. They didn't care. They cut off my money like 3 weeks before Christmas. And my health insurance, and I'm supporting they knew that I was supporting a family and kids, and that was going to be risky, but they'll do it anyway. So remember what Jesus said, that if you can trust people in the little things, then you can trust them in the big things. If you can't trust them in the little things, you can't trust them in the big things. I think that these are people who are running the evangelical world, who are ruthless to the extent that I would say, I think a lot of them are not Christian. I doubt that many of them are actually saved and believe in Christ, because that kind of behavior is not the behavior of someone who believes in Jesus Christ and who believes the gospel. I'm sorry. But I have no doubt that if they had an army, and if what stood in their way was someone that they could justify giving orders to have someone else kill someone, that they would kill people for it, because that's the kind of bloodthirst that they have. The way that they went after Paige Patterson, I mean, and everyone who was tied to him, and they constantly bring up his name even now to kind of, and even though you look at on the sex abuse issue, you look at what Mueller did with his entanglements with C.J. Mahaney, and the fact that this woman, Hannah Kate Williams, who's the big sex abuse victim, she was abused at Southern when Mueller was the president there. So, I mean, he had a lot more guilt even on that issue than Paige Patterson did. But, that doesn't stop them from continuing to demonize and to shift blame in ways that are false and dishonest and hypocritical, and they're ruthless. And, it is very scary to see that take over the church, for that to take over buildings and congregations that are named for Jesus Christ. I think that it is a testament to just how easily corrupted the human spirit is. And part of what enemies within the church does is it really forces you to understand that the church is not immune to all of this. Like you said, it's the same thing that you see in the political world. I almost do agree with you that it's worse, partially because I think the church attracts a lot of ambitious people who have fewer talents than the kind of ambitious people who congregate towards politics. The people who go to the church because they want to make a name for themselves, these are people who are dumber, less skilled, more socially inept than the people who flock to Washington to get ahead in politics. Do you agree with this? Or, I mean, these are some of the people who really, really just, they go to the church because they see that if you become a pastor or you become a minister, you have a captive audience and there's money involved and there's not a lot of demands on you. And you're going to protect your turf against everyone else who's trying to angle for the same thing. But it's just, you don't see the same level even of savvy that you have in Washington, D.C. with people who, or Hollywood, with people who are trying to get ahead in entertainment. It really attracts some of the worst people in the world, which is scary because it's the Church of Jesus Christ. You'd think it would be the opposite, right?
Yeah, well, when you think about this, when you're looking at the political world, the people that get into politics, they have to be savvy because when you think about it, what they're trying to do is they're trying to manipulate the American people to vote in a particular way, or vote for them, or support them, or something along those lines. It's different when it comes to Christianity, because in Christianity, they actually have influence and power through manipulation and brainwashing over their congregation. So you see a lot of these megachurch pastors, what they have spiritual authority. A lot of these pastors teach that unless the pastor is blatantly commanding you to sin, you as somebody in the congregation must obey them. And if you don't obey them, you're sinning. When you think about that, the political world, they don't have that power, though they're kind of trying to as of late, especially the last couple of years. But specifically within the evangelical world, a lot of these guys, they run their churches like a cult. They run it like you're supposed to obey that senior pastor because he knows all. So when you think about it, the pastor has this kind of spiritual stranglehold over his congregation that he can manipulate and use to his advantage. And we see this happening over and over and over and over and over again. And I think that to a certain degree makes the church even more dangerous than the political world, because you have these corrupt pastors that don't have the savvy, they don't have the skill. A lot of times they don't have the theological understanding. They don't understand the way that Christ established the church and the biblical roles and who's supposed to be doing what and what restrictions they have on the pastorate and all of that kind of stuff. And you have these people that are essentially inept, unqualified to be pastors. And as you and I have discussed many times on the phone, a lot of these guys do not exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. I can't tell you how many of these guys, we look at these guys. Can you name any more than, let's say, half a dozen of these megachurch pastors that exhibit joy or self-control or peace? No, they're all angry and bitter, and they will do whatever it takes to crush anybody who comes in their path. That is not the fruit of the Spirit. What is the fruit of the Spirit? The fruit of the Holy Spirit being inside of you, which means that you're a believer. You're one of God's chosen people. If you're not showing the fruit of the Spirit, there's reason to question your salvation. And that's where I think you've been spot on this entire time in calling a lot of this the Antichrist Church.
Yeah, and I think that there is so much joy that you can find in church. Like, I love the church that I'm part of now. I mean, there are churches that are out there. There are good pastors that I love my pastor. There are good folks that are out there. But unfortunately, I think the evangelical world as a whole is really under the influence of a lot of these people who, I have been calling it the Antichrist Church, because I don't think a lot of these people are Christian. I think what if I can diagnose them, or if I can narrate what I think happened, is these are people who, they just had some kind of innate prideful ambition, or they had some ideological obsession that they had, and they realized that they weren't going to be able to sell it. They weren't going to be able to get people to vote for it. They weren't going to be able to glorify it through art or anything like that. So what they saw was on churches that every Sunday for an hour, people sit in a captive audience and they listen to someone whom they respect talk at them, and they kind of go and act on that, and that there's money there that you can support your lifestyle with. And it's not that hard of a job, if you get into the right place at the right time. And so it's the worst, it's the lowest of ambitions. It's just like mediocrity combined with self-righteousness and combined with ruthlessness. And it's awful. And that's why the numbers are going down. That the number of professing Christians in the United States is plummeting. The number of baptisms is plummeting. The Southern Baptist Convention is hemorrhaging people. I don't know what the solution is. Sometimes I think the solution really honestly is to let a lot of it burn down. To let the hemorrhaging continue until you have a massive exodus, until people wake up and they realize that this is what has happened to the church. I don't think that I want to get involved in trying to salvage the church as the Christian right or as a political force to be reckoned with. I don't want to be involved in stuff like that, because that's kind of where it went wrong in the first place. You know what I mean? But I think that a documentary overall is a really good thing for people to see. And regarding what's happening in the Ukraine, I think it is really unfortunate that so many of the commentators, like the Karen Swallow Prior types that were on Twitter, that were bashing Christian nationalism all over the place. Do you remember those when all of them were talking about Christian? It was like on cue about a year, a little bit ago, and by on cue I mean CUE, not the Q, a non-movement. But they were all talking about Christian nationalism and how bad it was, et cetera, et cetera. And now they're bashing people who are questioning the Ukraine narrative that's out there in the media, and calling them unpatriotic, or you're all pro-Trump, pro-Putin, crazy people, or whatever. So it's like all of the things that we would normally associate that are wrong with Christian nationalism are now being promoted by the people who were criticizing Christian nationalism, and they never took a step back and said, wait a minute, why would Christian nationalism be wrong? Is it wrong because it would be authoritarian, and it would be too worldly, and it would be too political, and it would lead to censorship and repression? Well, then why didn't they criticize those very dynamics as they were playing out in the church leadership? They didn't say anything about it because they were friends with J.D. Greer. They were friends with Litton. They were friends with Mohler. That was their little camp of people, and they can't see it. They can't see it. I was part of the anti-war movement in 2002 and 2003. I hope I don't piss off too many people by saying that, but I was protesting against the Bush administration when they were wanting to go into Iraq. And what I learned from there was you have to take a step back, and you have to let a couple news cycles go through before you open your mouth and say anything, because most of what comes in on the news is false. It's fake news. If you don't have the discernment to be able to exercise that restraint and that caution, I think that you need to ramp up your prayer life, because if the Holy Spirit's guiding you, you're not going to rush into a lot of these kind of poorly worded political proclamations. I don't know how do you read this whole situation with people jumping on the bandwagon about the Ukrainian crisis?
I like you said, I've been calling for people to kind of take a step back and
Yeah.
And wait and see what's going on, because what's been interesting is the mainstream narrative, which is that Ukraine is, they're perfectly innocent. They're just this poor little democracy all by themselves, getting attacked by big bad Putin and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at this and I'm like, that doesn't necessarily sit well to me, especially with our understanding of their history of corruption and involvement with Joe Biden and the
Right.
Democrats and Romney and all these guys. And then you have the far right, kind of Q movement that is saying that Putin is doing this to root out the deep state and take out the bioweapon labs and all of that. And that doesn't necessarily sit well with me either. I think the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle. And I don't mind people having theories, because we can all look at this. We have theories, but
Right.
I think, in my opinion, we have to be very, very careful, very, very careful that we don't take our theories and then jump to the next step and say, this is what is actually going on factually. We have our theories, and then what we do is we look at the evidence, we look at the facts, we look at the documentation, we see, okay, does my theory align with that, or does it not? If it doesn't, then maybe I have to reassess and reevaluate my theory to go along with what the facts are. But I will say this, just because you hear something on the news, or you hear something from your favorite politician or your favorite pastor or favorite
Right.
whoever it is, don't take that as fact or truth. Actually go and research and actually figure out what is actually documented true, because that's where I think a lot of people are really easy kind of getting swayed to and fro with the winds, is because nobody's actually going to see what's actually documented true, as opposed to, well, my favorite guy said X, Y, and Z.
Well, yeah, there it's a question of they oversimplify everything, which is what exactly what happened uh, in 2002. I feel like this is a repeat of 2002, where all of the news stations were all on point. They were all repeating the exact same narratives. So many of the things that you hear end up not being true. I remember the first Persian Gulf War. When they came out with reports that Saddam Hussein had ordered babies to be removed from the incubators, I remember telling my friend, I'm like, that's not true. I bet you anything that, and it turned out, yeah, it was a fake story. Remember the picture of the little kid in Greece with his face down, washed up on that was not the real, that image wasn't
Yeah.
real. So many of these images are not real. And I don't know why people who have attacked Christian nationalism and attacked pro-Trump Christians for being knee jerk and for being ignorant and for not thinking things through, why they would be the ones jumping out in the front and endorsing so many different narratives without really knowing what the heck is going on. I mean, I think you'd have to really wait a while to figure out what is really happening in the Ukraine. But the larger picture I see of it is everything that is scary about watching a strong man invade another country. If we were to take a step back and we were to ask, what are the evils, the sins, the human flaws that lead to that? How, we should ask, how are we cultivating those same qualities in the evangelical world? And I'll stand by what I said, which is that the evangelical world has a lot of authoritarian personalities. It has a lot of people who are really interested in acquiring other people's territory, pushing people. They're invasive. You know what I mean? Like I lived through the whole thing in this with Southwestern Seminary, where a whole bunch of people from Southern who were tied to El Mohler came in and basically invaded the seminary. They didn't care. None of it was done for the good of the students. None of it was done in a Christian way whatsoever. It was totally anti-Christian. But they do it. So those same qualities, and then that leads to the censorship, that leads to the retaliation, that leads to the threats and the intimidation. And you and I have both seen it with the people we know, where people make a phone call behind your back to your church, to your job, to everywhere to get you fired. They don't care if your kids are going to starve. They don't care if you're going to be driven to suicide. Remember, Mike Adams killed himself.
Yeah.
And all of these Christian people, they kind of abandoned him, like towards the end there. So I think a lot of the same qualities, if you feel righteous indignation watching what happened with Putin's behavior, you should ask yourself, like, how are those same flaws playing out here? And not just in the political system. We could talk about that for, till the cows come home, but also, in the church sphere, which is what this documentary is trying to do. It's trying to show you all of the problems in church world, in the evangelical world. And what's going on. Now, let me just ask you, when you watch Enemies Within the Church, and they go over quite a bit the history of where this ideology came from, trying to be as rational and as sober about it as you can, okay, and as neutral or objective as you can, what would you say is the main reason that Marxism is incompatible with the Bible?
Because it redefines so many different issues, including redefining sin. So what oftentimes happens is sin becomes less and less about the individual person breaking God's commands, and it becomes more and more about what your group identity has done as an overall overarching group. And I think that there's a danger in there, because now what you're doing is you're redefining sin to where sin is no longer I broke God's commands. Sin is now, because I'm a straight white male, I've committed these sins, and that's what I have to repent from. You're beginning to lose sight of what the gospel is, because if you change the definition of sin, all of a sudden now you change. Well, what did Jesus come down to earth to live a perfect life, die on the cross? What did he actually pay for on the cross? Did he pay for the fact that I'm a straight white male? Or did he pay for the fact that, yeah, you know what, I sin by breaking some of God's commands? So if we can't even get some of these definitions right, and we're changing things, we're changing our belief system on what words mean and definitions and groupthink and all that kind of stuff. Now you're changing the gospel. Now, just by changing that one little aspect, that one definition of sin, from me breaking God's commands to it being more of a social group or social construct, or me being
Yeah.
a whatever it is, all of a sudden now, what did Christ save us from? Did he save us from our own sin, or did he save us for being something that we are inherently born with? I mean, when you really think about that, just that one small little change, even though they're using the exact same words when they're presenting the gospel, but by changing that one definition, now they're out there preaching a flat out false gospel that has absolutely no place in the church. You are not going to find that ideology, that groupthink, that worldview anywhere in Scripture. It's about the individual person and what they are responding to when it comes to God's commands and the gospel invitation and things along those lines.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the you hit it right on the target, because what ends up happening is when you create these categories for collective grievances, and you're doing that in the church setting, you're earmarking certain people who they can blame the evil, the wretchedness of the world on somebody else, because they're always a victim, which means they don't have to repent and they don't have to forgive. And then, so what, I mean, everyone wants to be in a position where you don't have to forgive and you don't have to repent of anything. I mean, that's what an enviable position. So of course, everyone's rushing to identify with one victim group over another. So you have someone like Jonathan Merritt, who's a white guy, from the South. His dad was a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, but he comes out as gay. So now all of a sudden, he gets to just sit there and play the victim, and he doesn't have to forgive anyone. He doesn't, you know what I'm saying? You create a really bitter, nasty community. You poison the church when you started out by wanting to be loving, by wanting to acknowledge the fact that there were groups that engaged in something that hurt another group. You want to kind of help heal that, but in the end, there's no reconciliation, because one side just doesn't feel like they have to forgive anything, and not just forgive that one group, but it becomes a lifelong thing. They're not going to be forgiving towards anyone. I'm trying to think of who's like Karen Swallow Prior. Do you ever see her exhibit forgiving behavior on Twitter? Or like Beth Moore? I've never seen her forgive. I mean, when they have someone that they want to criticize, they'll just keep on, going and attacking them, and they'll never let up. Did anyone say that they wanted to forgive Jerry Falwell Jr. for, you know what I mean? It's like, there's no, it becomes a bitter, nasty, judgmental world. It's totally contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And I hope that, yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, on that note, taking it back to the gospel on that specific issue as well, by creating this victim mentality, and I see this a lot with like the Jonathan Merritts and people along those lines. What they're actually doing is they're changing the gospel to where what did Jesus come down to save us from? And a lot of times those kind of victimhood claims and things along those lines, that then warps their gospel, because now all of a sudden, now you're preaching, well, Jesus is actually saving you from being persecuted, from being for your homosexuality, or for being a woman, or for being a minority, or for whatever it is. Jesus is coming to save you from being oppressed by these other people. But that's not what Jesus is actually supposed to be saving you from. He's supposed to be saving you from your own sin, from the punishment from your sin. But what we continually see is that the pitch to the lost by these woke social justice warriors oftentimes is that put your faith in Jesus Christ, and then he will deal with these oppressors. That is not the gospel, but that's the kind of gospel that I see from the Jonathan Merritt type crowd, where they're constantly crying victim.
Yeah, and you know what? All of these Marxist causes that have gotten so big in the church, the problem too is that every group that they set out to help ends up worse off under the system that they create. I think for women, for Blacks, for sex abuse victims, for people who are struggling with their sexual identity, I have great sympathy for all of these groups. But one of the most empowering things, one of the most healing things in life is to be able to forgive other people. And when you block people from that ability of saying, you know what, I forgive you. I'm going to let this go. I'm just going to move on. Right. That is so liberating. That is true liberation from bondage, is when you can let that go and say, I'm not going to chase after justice, vengeance anymore. God will take care of righting this wrong. I'm going to move on with my life. So I'm going to forgive you. That is so, it's so empowering, because that gives you're in a position of power. You're strong enough to be able to let go of something instead of clinging to it, like your life depends on it. And when you tell Black people or Hispanic people or women or sex abuse victims that they shouldn't want that liberation, or you don't have confidence that they're capable of it, you're really prejudiced against them. You're hurting them in a major way. And so I hope that the film brings out some of this. I hope people don't look at the documentary and just get lost in the political camp, or get really defensive, or get really entrenched in whatever their opinion is on these specific issues. Because I think it really is a much deeper issue of, is the gospel getting lost with what you're talking about, where group grievances are replacing, individual repentance? And B, what the heck is going on? How do we see people in the church behaving like authoritarian dictators? Why is it that the evangelical world is feeling more and more like, a Cold War dictatorship? Yeah, that's scary as well.
Yeah, well, and I think that there's another comparison with the way that these evangelical leaders are behaving, and that's this cult mentality. And I would argue that a lot of evangelicalism is actually a cult. Like, if you go back and you watch Leah Remini's documentary on A&E about Scientology and coming out of that, a lot of the exact same tactics that are happening in the evangelical church are also is exactly what David Miscavige does with the Church of Scientology. It's very scary when you see the comparisons. You actually look at what guys like Al Mohler and John MacArthur and a lot of these elitists that are going on, and the way that like Adam Greenway has behaved, and Russell Moore and Beth Moore and all these people, they all act in the same cult mentality. And it's to protect themselves, protect their power, protect their income, protect their status. It's the exact same cult mentality that the Pharisees use. It's the same, or the false prophets of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
They'll persecute anybody that comes in their path, calls them out, compares what they're doing with Scripture. They will destroy them. You've experienced it. I've experienced it. A lot of our friends have experienced it, and I believe that the enemies within the church team is right now experiencing it with the release of their documentary.
Yeah.
So that's where anybody who's watching this, what you can actually do is you can actually come around and you can actually support the film. Go watch the film. Go buy the film. Talk to your local church and pastor about hosting a viewing or renting it to be able to distribute to your church, or view or show or whatever it might be. Because it's not going to be the standard, go to the main, websites and media outlets and interviews on podcasts and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be each individual person trying to come up with a solution and bypass the current corrupt system. Because I'm telling you, these leaders and these elites are going to do everything they can to try to shut down information like what you're going to get in the Enemies Within the Church documentary. And so that's where you have a play in this to actually get more people exposed to this.
Yeah, and it's so important to get behind the people who are trying to reform the church world, because that's the lifeblood of Western civilization. Our churches, that's what where people are getting their worldview, and if that deteriorates, obviously we're going to feel the repercussions far and wide. I think that you bring up a really good point. We should definitely go to that website. It's $13, I think, or $14.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's about, that's worth it. Support people who are actually trying to change it. Don't wallow in the bitterness that I was just criticizing. I have forgiven, in my own way, all of the people in the evangelical world that I had that bad experience with, because I've moved on and I've kind of pulled out of the debate. I'm just coming out of hiding to be able to talk a little bit about the movie. But I think like if we can look towards things that are positive, put money towards people who are actually trying to change things and trying to build an alternative, And support Gatekeepers Online, because Jeff is also trying to build an alternative. And hopefully we will have that second conference in the Cancel Proof Christianity series. But thank you very much for joining me, Jeff. So what's next that people can look for on your end?
Yeah, I'm actually right now. It's been taking up the majority of my time, which is where I haven't been able to do even my shows as much and all that kind of stuff. But we've been doing a series of events. We just did our first one. It's called the American Action Summits, and the first one was called "In Medical Tyranny." And we had people. I think pretty much all the speakers were believers and were Christians, which was amazing. But we had Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, Dr. Mark Sherwood. We had a bunch of other great speakers as well, but talking about the actionable steps that people can take in order to protect your medical freedom, whether it's vaccines, COVID-19, whatever it is. We're putting together a few more online summits as well, and things like election fraud and rooting out the rhinos out of the Republican Party. We might hop into some evangelical stuff as well, but we're going to be doing a series of these and kind of ramp up to the summer. And then who knows, maybe we might be coming out with some live in-person events as well, and trying to bring together some of the top conservative and Christian voices to really educate people and train people, not just sitting back and watching somebody else try to save the country, but giving you the tools just as an average everyday American on what are things that you can do to help turn things around. Because just even as a country, it's designed to be we the people, not go look at your favorite celebrity politician or conservative pundit or even pastor and rely on them to fix things. You can do something as well. So that's really the focus of that. That's what's been taking up the majority of my time as of late.
All right, great. Thank you. And my book is coming out very soon.
Yep.
So yeah, Cancel Proof Christianity. I'm putting the last touches on that. Well, thank you very much to everyone who watches this, out there in the universe. And hopefully let's keep an eye on things and see whether we can get the church back on track. All right. Thanks.